If you fly FPV drones, you probably know what PIDs are, at least at a passing level. I've been flying for a while now, and to be honest, I mostly ignored PIDs. After all, beta flight defaults keep getting better and better. Why not just leave it to the experts and worry more about the dozens of other things you have to worry about? But then one day, I decided I had ignored them long enough, and it was time to really dig in and try to understand at a deep level what the mysterious PID control system was doing. What I found, though, was when I started working out what a PID controller really does, is a beautiful, elegant system that I think, once you understand it better at a gut level, will change the way you think about every aspect of quadcopter flight. So, I invite you to follow along with me for the next few minutes as I try to pull back the curtain just a bit. So a few caveats are in order. This discussion came out of my need to understand the mysterious. I made videos of drones doing kooky things. I read a lot. I wrote a PID controller from scratch. This all doesn't make me an expert, it just makes me someone who likes to make mistakes, then pass on what I've learned in hopes that it helps someone else down the line. I'm trying to keep it simple here. We'll focus on one axis. As much as possible, we'll focus on one variable at a time. It'll be some math, but all the math you need you probably learned by the 3rd grade. I won't get into logging, I won't try to get bogged down into charts and graphs, but as a consequence of this, the discussion will oversimplify some things and ignore others. So with that, let's jump in. So let's start with the basic system. In any PID-controlled system, we need 3 things: a measurable state, a goal state, and a way to change that state. Given what we know about where we are and where we want to be, what do? Let's pretend we're playing a carnival game. Like one of those that you're trying to roll a bowling ball into a buzzer by pushing it just the right amount. Instead of a bowling ball, we'll use a matchbox car. Our starting position's here. Our goal is here. Keep in mind, my car doesn't have any brakes. It's a matchbox car. I'm only allowed one push, one time. How much do I push it? Well, one way to decide is to measure where we're at and where the goal is and find the distance between the 2 points. Call that the error. If this error is 5 inches, then we'll push the car with 5% of our finger strength. If it's 10 inches, 10%. That would be proportional control, or P. So let's try it. Oops, too far. I lose. Let's say the carney says I have 2 turns to try. So I check my error again. I see it's about 1 inch. So I'm going to use a little less push, 1%. Let's try that. Uh-oh, overshot again, lost again. Well, let's say the carney says, okay, I'll give you 3 turns. So again, I measure the error, use that to decide how hard to push, and give it a 3rd try. Overshot again. We could keep going, 5 turns, 10, 20. If we just use our basic strategy, though, we'll almost always overshoot. There's very little stability to this strategy. What I'm doing here is acting like a basic PID controller with no I and no D. Each turn I take is a PID loop. If I took 1,000 or 8,000 turns a second, I'd be doing it as fast as a drone's flight controller. Alright, let's start over. New game. This time, though, let's say the car is a little bit heavier. Again, I measure the error. Let's say it's about 5 inches. So if I was doing the same strategy I did last time, I'd push it with 5% of my finger strength. But this time it barely moves. Maybe what I need is a multiplier for each car. So for the first car, my multiplier was 1. Five inches times 1, 5% power. Here, maybe I need my multiplier to be more like 10. 5 inches times 10 will be 50% power. So let's try that. Yeah, that's better. That multiplier, we call that the P gain, or sometimes P for short. So let's take that idea and apply it to the FPV drone world. This is an online acro mode drone PID simulator, a PID playground if you will. We can plug in any numbers we want without fear of breaking anything. To keep things simple, it's limited to one axis, the roll axis. Again, we need three things. We need a measurable state, a goal state, and a way to get there. Our goal state's the control stick. It tells us how quickly we want the drone to spin on its axis. This sort of simulates the transmitter if you're flying a real drone. Our measurable state's the drone's gyro. It tells us how quickly the drone is actually spinning on its axis. Our way to get there to where we want to go is the motors. So spin the left motors to roll right, spin the right motors to roll left. So to look at how the proportional control and the P gain affects things, we're zeroing out our other controls so they have no effect, and focus on P. So as I move around left and right, you can see that the virtual drone tries to get its virtual gyro to match the slider using its virtual motors. And again, we see that if all we have is proportional control, we're going to overshoot every time. Too far left, too far right, over and over, and we get oscillations. If we raise our P gain, we just overshoot faster and faster. You have very little stability. Let's see how that would look on a real drone. Again, we're going to focus our experiment on the roll axis only. And just like with the virtual drone, we'll completely zero out the I and the D components, so the proportional control is really doing all the steering. Now we set our goal rotational speed with the stick, which is shown on our stick overlay here. And the proportional control will try to get the drone's gyro to match the goal speed using the four motors. With a weak P gain, our motors are weakly pushing us towards our goal. Feels very wishy-washy. With a higher P gain, we have the power we need, but now we're overshooting or bouncing back all over the place. With very high P gains, the drone is unflyable. Clearly, we need to add something to our control scheme. Okay, so going back to our Matchbox car example, let's see if we can improve our game strategy a bit to help prevent those overshoots. Let's say on every turn we have, in addition to calculating our P control or P term, we're also going to keep an eye on how fast our error is changing and try to slow it down a bit. This control, the new control, doesn't care where we are, it just cares how fast we got there. So on turn 1 we see our error is, let's say, 5 inches. And once we calculate that, we'll just save that number. On turn 2, after we've pushed it a bit with our P term, we're going to check our error again and find the difference to the last error. Here we see it's -2. We've gone past by 2 inches. So finding the difference between that and our first value would be -7. We're going to add that -7 or subtract 7 to the P to get our final force. If we're moving fast, we subtract a lot. If we're moving slow, we subtract a little bit. If we aren't moving at all, we subtract nothing at all. So we can think of this as like an invisible hand pushing back against our P term and pushing by an amount based on our speed. This has the effect of just slowing everything down. As we get closer and closer to our goal, the invisible hand pushes less and less, letting us ease up to where we want to be. We might still overshoot, but it's less and less. And if we push back just right, we barely overshoot at all. This pushback is our derivative control, or D term. It's always added with the P term to get our final push force. They go hand in hand, so to speak. If you hear about the PD balance, that's what we're talking about. The ratio between these two push-pull forces is important and it's what keeps things stable. So just like with the P term, we need a multiplier to tweak to allow us to find a balance. That's the D gain. Moving to our virtual model, let's take that simple P-only controller and start adding in some D gain. As we move the D gain closer to the P gain levels and beyond, we start to get more stability, less bounce back and overshoot. Testing this out in the real world, let's add in some D gains, and now we have a PD controller. Still zeroing out our I for now. We can immediately see some improvement. Let's return one more time to our car example. We've got our P and D terms working together to get us to our goal in a balanced way. In an ideal world, this might be all we need. But things are usually not ideal. Let's say in our carnival game, the carnies notice that we're getting pretty good at the game now. So he starts leaning on the table, making it crooked. For just using our P and D strategy to figure out how hard to push each turn, we'll probably eventually get to a point where our push-pull forces are in balance, but we're a little off because of that lean. We never quite get to the goal. So let's add a third component to our strategy, to add to the P and D. Let's say that on every turn we measure our error and keep a running tally of it, and add that running tally to our calculation. If we're a little off, that running tally just gets bigger and bigger. And eventually, big enough to push us to where we want to be. Another name for this is our integral control, or I term. Just like with P and D, we have a multiplier for this term, the I gain. Together, the P, I, and D gains are the knobs we have available to tweak how our game strategy operates, what the stronger components are, what the weaker ones are, and what the ratios are between the three terms. Now let's go back to our simulator. You might have noticed before that we have a little bit of a drift, even if we're not doing anything. And that could be because of wind, virtual wind, of course, or lopsidedness, or bent propeller. Whatever it is, there's a systemic error that's making us lopsided, even when the P and D have stabilized things. Adding a little I term clears that right up. But what happens if we keep raising our I multiplier? Remember, the I term is tallying errors, and if we multiply those tallies by a big number, at a point the P and D can't rein the tally in and we get error buildup. This is sometimes known as I term windup, and it's best avoided. So let's keep our I gain to a manageable level. In the real world, we also have some lopsidedness. Without any I term in the mix, the drone drifts over to the right, and I have to continually fight it. Add a little I gain, though, and the drift goes away. But just like with our pretend drone, if we keep raising the I term, we risk I term windup. At its extreme, the motors start to grind, and I had to disarm here to free fall and keep from burning them up. So once we do have some gain numbers that work well for our particular craft, in the end we're adding them all together to get a final output value. That value drives the amount of power sent to the motors, which hopefully moves the quad closer to where we want to be. Then we check the gyro to see how far off we are and repeat the calculations over again. Do that a few thousand times a second and we have a controllable, relatively stable flight. So the key things to remember are: 1. PID controller is what connects the input to the output. It's the invisible hand. And 2, the goal is stability and connecting cause and effect. Everything else is preference. So I hope you found at least some of this useful. And I hope in even a small way it helps your mental picture of what goes into a well-tuned quad and why things might sometimes go wrong. I think the PID concept's pretty beautiful in its elegance and really a useful concept to understand. So happy flying!